So next is an example from the Okanagan Wenatchee. Jo has been, she's a NEPA coordinator as well as a district wildlife biologist up there and has been there a while.
29 years?
29 years and counting backwards from there. So she's going to give an example of the kind of restoration thoughts they're putting to that landscape up there. So help me welcome Jo.
I'm not a PowerPoint pro, so I hope this goes well. And I'm also kind of a substitute for our forest biologist, Andrea Lyons, who could not attend. And she basically got me started by providing a PowerPoint that was used in the presentation to national leadership in 2013 about our forest restoration strategy. So I'll apologize. Basically, I have notes from Andrea about the first part of this PowerPoint, but then I asked her if I could bring my perspective to this discussion as a practitioner. I am not an architect of any policy or any model. I am the one that takes these tools and tries to work with an ID team and get a project out the door. And I write the BAs that go to consultation, and then I write the EAs. So you're very much, the latter part of my talk will be from the perspective of a practitioner. So let's do this. Okay, well, basically, based on national and regional direction and the best available science, we have developed a vision for the restoration strategy on the Okanagan Wenatchee, and it's designed to restore our forest patterns and our processes and functions so that we can increase our resilience to climate change and large-scale disturbance, including wildfire and flooding. And we have written a peer-reviewed document. A great deal of thought has gone into this. We work very closely with the Forest Service lab in Wenatchee. And we feel, this is exciting. We're very, very excited about this. I'm forgetting to hit the clicks here, so. Nope, going backwards? Pardon? Down arrow. Oh, you're going up here then. Okay, here we go. There we go. So we are desperate, we are really looking for a more resilient landscape. And we are working collaboratively and strategically across large landscapes. And our focus now is on a restoration outcome. And the measures of our success, basically, instead of board feet, we really want to look at acres restored. And we are adapting these strategies based on the new science and the changed conditions and the monitoring that we are doing. So, based on our national direction, and let's see, there we go. I'm getting backwards here, so, well, let's go here. Little bit of context about the Okanagan Wenatchee. We're 4 million acres, basically extending from the Canadian border south to Mount Rainier. An incredibly diverse forest. Elevations range from 800 to 9,500 feet. Rainfall ranges from 10 inches on the far eastern edges of the forest to 140 inches. Let's see here. So, and of course, this creates a huge diversity of habitats to manage. We have over 400 species of fish and wildlife, including a number of threatened and endangered species, spotted owl and steelhead. And much of our forest was historically dry and mostly covered with very widely spaced ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, and this was an area where we had frequent historic fires. Low intensity too. They were rarely very large and they were rarely very hot. So our restoration strategy was sort of born in fire in 1994. We had a very, very severe fire season. Some of you may remember names like Rat Creek and Tyee fires. And we're talking about fires that occurred on the order of hundreds of thousands of acres. So mostly on the north end of the forest. So we had to start thinking about management differently, and we needed a plan to address management in the context of large-scale disturbances. So our restoration strategy was actually born as a dry forest restoration strategy back in 1998. And some of those things that we were considering back there, that we were looking at altered fire regimes, insect and disease outbreaks occurring on a larger and larger scale, habitat sustainability, and also communities at risk. We have WUI, wildland-urban interface, occurring all across the forest. So we were also starting to see, at the same time, we were starting to hear words like restoration and resilience. So everything seemed to be dovetailing for us, and that was fortuitous. And we were learning about the potential impacts of climate change and thinking that that would result in shifts in species distribution. Think wolverine, which we're dealing with on the north end of the forest too. And also loss of habitat connectivity, particularly for owls. So with these increases in disturbance, we have predictions of burning 2 to 3 times more acreage in the next 30 years. So we live with fire on the Okanagan-Wenatchee. And along with these kinds of changes, we can also expect to see changes in the hydrologic regimes, increased flooding and road damage. We do have, our restoration strategy has an aquatic component, but the talk I'm giving today will focus on the vegetation side. So let's go down here. So I'm not quite sure what Andrea meant by the picture that you see there, but anyway, I've scratched my head, and if I knew how to get it out, I probably would. But at this point, I want to talk about the key issues for a restoration on our forest. And basically, all of the information we were considering has morphed into this document. This is our restoration strategy. And we're moving away from looking at stands, and the first look that we are taking now is based on landscapes, and we're talking landscapes on the order of 50,000 acres plus, Huck 10s and Huck 6s, that type of thing. And it begins with the landscape evaluation and photo interpretation. At this point, after we have delineated stands and attributed stands, this is very important. We have an integrated process where your wildlife biologist, the silviculturist, and your fire specialist are sitting down together very, very, very early to look at that landscape together. And we're looking at the amount of habitat or patches that we have there and the patterns, the distribution. So basically, the 4 major components are vegetation. We talk about cover type, the potential vegetation, structural classes, insect and disease risk. And we also look at key ecological features such as large and old trees and the spatial variability of that. And we look at fire movement across the landscape. We're running fire, crown fire potential, and that type of thing. And this is just sitting us at a table looking at these attributes that we have been derived, that we have mapped through the EMDS model. I'll explain that in a minute. EMDS is the Ecosystem Management Decision Support software that we use. It's a tool. And it's been an interesting journey as an ID team member taking this tool and applying it. So the point of this tool is that we are looking at a landscape, and we have, using the works of Hesper, we have reference conditions where we have analyzed what we call the historic range of variation. And the EMDS software helps us compare our current conditions with that historic reference condition. And from that, we analyze the departures. And we use those departures to develop a landscape prescription. And then, this is long before any NEPA starts. Once we have a landscape description, then we can come up with a purpose and need for actually taking action. And once you have a purpose and need, you can develop a proposed action, and then you round the corner and you actually start the NEPA project. So the nice thing about the EMDS, the software too, is that it allows us to make different assumptions about our reference conditions. If we are worried about climate change, we can select a different reference condition, a hotter, drier landscape perhaps, and see how far departed we are from a landscape if it were to become warmer and drier. And we could also go warmer and wetter. So it's going to give us some flexibility to make different assumptions and see how our landscape, how resilience is affected by our landscape. So at this point, like I said, we haven't developed the aquatic piece of our software yet. We're working on it. Right now what's happening, all the districts are implementing some form of restoration, but it's based largely on the knowledge of the people who have worked there for a while. Many of our hydrologists and fish biologists are very familiar with places where roads are impeding floodplain migration, and where we have problems with culverts, or where we are chronically dumping sediment into creeks. So right now we're relying on their input to assess those areas, include those in our restoration. So, maybe let's go down here, page down. Okay, so the benefits when you start with a landscape level look. We are going across all ownership boundaries. There is private land in some of these landscapes, but initially we're blind to it. And this can create some opportunities for partnerships and doing work collaboratively across those borders. And it also makes us more transparent to our neighbors and to other people who are interested in what we're doing. So we are comparing our current landscape with historical conditions, and it's based on very rigorous science, largely the works from Hesberg. We can look at those climate change adaptations and look at warmer, drier conditions, warmer, wetter adjacent landscapes. And we can manage for wildlife in a very dynamic, future-oriented fashion, instead of thinking of wildlife as mitigation for basically getting the timber sale out. I can tell you, as a wildlife biologist, it is wonderful to be sitting at the table early in the discussions. It's very, very refreshing. And actually, the whole ID team is appreciating that, I think. This process also allows me to do a little bit of gaming with some of the wildlife objectives that we would like to achieve, and I'll demonstrate that a little bit later on. Okay, so again, this is a little bit of a recap. This is 118 pages of information, and so we begin with our basic aerial photo interp over a very large scale. We delineate stands, and we attribute those stands according to vegetation structure, type, and from that we derive other variables. And we're looking at different types of wildlife habitat, the way fire is going to move across that landscape. We're looking at insect and disease vulnerability. All of this is derived from the vegetative condition. And then we basically, after considering all of that, we're going to identify the places on the landscape where we could focus our efforts. And at that point, it's a line officer decision. Where are we going to go to plan this project? And what's important to me? What kind of variables are we going to focus on? So it creates a lot of efficiencies, for sure. When you start with a landscape prescription, then you have a logic flow from where you can develop your purpose and need, and everything flows from purpose and need. So much more efficient to start out with an overview, a destination in sight. So many efficiencies come to play, and every district is dabbling a little bit. And in 2013, Becky Heath was our forest supervisor at the time, issued a letter of direction that all the districts would begin implementing restoration. So we're all in various stages of planning, and the adventure begins. One of the first ones, the test model basically, happened on the Natchez Ranger District, and which is just east of Mount Rainier and south of the district where I work. They went through this process. It took them a little longer because they're trying to figure out what the tool meant. But once they did, they were able to produce a project called Glass Angel, which after they got that out of the door, they were able to do another project within 18 months. The efficiency there is you've identified a landscape prescription and you're implementing various projects within that landscape. So you don't have to repeat all that landscape level analysis and evaluation. So multiple projects out of one landscape. That's where our efficiency is. So why is it a good idea for spotted owls? And basically, we've got, you all heard from various presenters that we're unprecedented declines, unexpected declines in our spotted owl populations, even the demography study area that we have on my district. And the predicted levels of loss of habitat under the Northwest Plan have been far exceeded, primarily due to fire. We've done pretty well holding the line in terms of mechanical removal of habitat, but the fires are causing precipitous loss of owl habitat. So we are exceeding the assumptions of the Northwest Forest Plan, and that's cause for alarm. Let's see, here we go. And the situation is further exacerbated on our forest by barred owl, spotted owl interactions. Peter Singleton recently finished his research on the district to the north of mine, and through that we now have an understanding of how barred owls are displacing our spotted owls into more dry and mesic forests, which means that if the dry and mesic forests are becoming are going to be much more important for spotted owl recovery than we may have anticipated under the forest plan. The owl is not going to persist if we're going to lose our moist forest to barred owls and our mesic dry forests to natural disturbances like wildfire. So if we can strategically place treatments on the landscape that treat 20 to 30%, we may be able to change landscape fire behaviors and optimize habitat. And this is a concept that was, I guess, promoted or promulgated first by Mark Finney and John Lamkula. We think that by being very strategic, we are going to be able to treat, we're going to be able to increase that resilience and maintain our high-value spotted owl habitat. So, it's parsing out the landscape. This is what EMDS does for us. And on the lower scale, you can see how valuable is a particular area to spotted owls versus how important is it to restore that area. And if you're in that lower left-hand quadrant, it's low-value spotted owl habitat, and it's not really an area that's at high risk to fire. Is that where we want to be putting our efforts? No. But if you are in high-value spotted owl habitat, and it's not an area with a high restoration need or value, those are the areas where we're going to emphasize retention of spotted owl habitat. That top right-hand box, though, is a situation where we have, in our WUI, where we do have areas where there is a high need, maybe some urgency even, to treatments that will reduce risk, and but we also have a high need for spotted owls. So this is what I call threading the needle. We're trying to find a way to balance all of these competing needs. Let's see here. So our restoration strategy basically helps us solve a few questions. It helps us identify where we have the high-value habitats and how much of it we need to treat to have a landscape level effect. And, but doesn't necessarily answer how to treat. And for this, you know, we're going to look to the examples of our districts. So I'm going to go down here. Oh, okay. We're still, this is a slide that, what I'm seeing here is two different things on the screen. Okay, so just some challenges and opportunities from the forest perspective about a restoration strategy. We still need to finish that aquatic roads piece. And we're working on how we can prioritize the order in which we enter these large landscapes. And right now, our districts are pretty much at maximum capacity, and this is a huge investment of people's time and limited funding. So we really do need to be strategic about how we enter these. And because it's critical habitat, on some districts, it's actually increasing the workload. I have to say, on my district, it hasn't, and I'll demonstrate that in a minute. And we're still working our way through. The very first project that we tried, the Glass Angel on the Natchez, was basically not in critical habitat. It was not in LSR. And it was handled through an informal consultation. They were not affecting owl habitat. So perhaps not a real test of how this thing is going to play out on a complicated landscape. Huge opportunity here is the collaboration with our partners, the Forest Service Lab. And a challenge here is how are we going to measure our outcomes? Is it going to be in board feet or acres restored? At one point we talked about creating some crosswalk where we could focus on the acres restored and we would deal with the actual targets. We haven't been successful at that, so we're still trying to balance it all. So now we want to give it a test drive, a different kind of test drive. We're going to my district, the Cle Elum Ranger District, which is basically all LSR or Snoqualmie Pass AMA, which is managed as LSR. You can see the lighter green, there's a little triangle, let's see if I can get this to work, right there, and a little triangle right there. That is matrix, that's where we manage for commodity production in my district. And we have been, this is actually all of its critical habitat. One of our, I think out of 20 sections, 10 sections of matrix are now in critical habitat. So we have been dealing with critical habitat and LSR standards and guidelines since 1992 for the critical habitat and 1994 from the Northwest Forest Plan. So owls and LSR and critical habitat have been part of our vernacular basically for most of my tenure there. So the biggest restoration challenge on our district is on the east side, a place called Swat Creek along Highway 97, partway between Cle Elum and Wenatchee. It's complex because we are in what's called a source LSR. Our LSR assessment identified 3 particular LSRs on the forest where we hope to maintain a self-maintaining population of spotted owls. They were sized to support 20 to 25 pairs of owls. And at one time, we were exceeding that number. It's all critical habitat. It was in 1992, it was in 2008, and now it is again. And most of this habitat is occupied still. And it is part, but this is the great thing, we are part of the long-term spotted owl demography study. So we have tremendous information about what our owls are doing. Almost 25 years worth, I think, and that has been a huge help. It's wildland-urban interface. The little community of Liberty sits right there. This is a Liberty Mountain home. We have homeowners scattered here, here, and in all these little sub-drainages here. So we have a great deal of woolly. And we have prolonged spruce budworm defoliation that is causing hillsides to turn red and then gray and causing a great deal of concern to the folks that are living right below those slopes. Very complex area, very complex history, timber harvest, high grading, multiple entries, mining, you name it. It's all occurred there. So we thought this would be a good place to test how the restoration strategy is going to work. So we begin with our photo interp. This is a real quick walkthrough of the types of steps that we go through. In this case, for this watershed, we have two different ecological reference conditions. The southwest quadrant there with the yellow lines is a warmer, drier reference condition than the rest of the landscape. And we, in addition to delineating stands, we're looking at vegetation. Now, you can't see, you probably can't read the keys there, but the key thing here is to look at the patterns. And if you see this light green, there's a lot of light green on this landscape. And that is a structural condition class called Young Forest Multi-Story, YIFMUS we call it. And our software is doing a very complex statistical analysis telling us that we have way more of that structural type on our landscape than ever occurred in our reference condition, greatly exceeding the historic range of variability. We're also looking at the way fire moves across the landscape. This one's flame length, but we also look at running crown fire potential and things like that. So it's a mapping exercise. And owl habitat at this point is a derived variable from the vegetation data. Okay, so I can't help it. It drives our ecologists nuts, but I am going to, I start drawing circles. I have to. It's just habit after 29 years of this. I want to see how this lines up with what owls are actually using based on 25 years worth of spotted owl data. And kind of testing is, a little reality check for our modeling. And it lines up pretty well if I combine spotted owl habitat in green and the potential spotted owl habitat. The difference between those two is in the presence of large trees. So to account for the owls that I know are there now, I basically have to combine those types. The model not only takes the owl habitat analysis that I've done, it took the fire, it took our analysis of vegetation, and it kind of weights those variables. We decided early in the process that owls and fire are driving this project because of the critical habitat status and the LSR status. So it basically, we create an Uber map. The colors just indicate patterns. It's telling us that in these areas we have departed metrics for stands that are affecting the resilience of the landscape. We call it the Uber map. We're not quite, the team then takes this to the line officer and says, okay, here's the pros and cons of going here first or there first. Where would you like us to go? And our line officer picked that southeast quadrant because basically of the issues related to woolly and spruce budworm and the fact that we knew we had departed landscape metrics that we could be fixing in there. And then it's a go back. Once she's picked that area, we're going to zoom in on that area and start looking about how and what needs to be changed to push us back towards the historic range of variability. Now, so this is my modeled owl habitat. It's either owl habitat or it's not. And again, we're looking at the reality of these are occupied owl circles, or at least they were when we started this process. We decided, just because this was our first walk, we would kind of focus our efforts in this area. This would become our PLTA. And I don't want you to focus on the statistics. This table, the Uber model, the analysis gives us table after table after table of statistics. And when you're on an ID team and you start talking about Simpson's diversity index and Hill's N1 and Hill's N2, and eyes kind of glaze over, but there are some parameters such as percent land, the largest patch index, the patch density, the mean patch size. Those are concepts we can all get our hands around. And for us to visually display this, basically these two columns indicate what the historic range of variation is. These two indicate the minimum observed and the maximum observed. And here's our value. And when our value, our current value, is within the historic range of variation, I colored it green. This is telling me that percent land for marten habitat is way departed from our reference condition. At 8.9% of the land, I have too much marten habitat compared to the reference condition for this particular piece of the landscape. Yellow is when this color here is when I'm outside the historic range of variability, but still within the range of all values observed. Green is good. And we think a resilient landscape, we're going to be able to put many of those back towards green. Here's owl. And basically, my percent land is within HRV. And actually, I'm kind of well within HRV. If I needed to make more, if I'm just looking at this from an owl perspective, I could grow more habitat here to provide demographic support for recovering population. But patch density and edge density are way outside the historic range of variability, way outside. And this proved to be a pattern with many of the things that we were looking at. So we decided that we could focus on patch density, mean patch size, and edge density. We did white-headed woodpecker habitat again. Some departed, some within HRV. But you know what? It was a very small percentage of our landscape, and we decided we're not going to worry about it. It's not driving the bus, so to speak. And I decided, I practiced a little bit, okay? I wanted to see what would happen to those metrics if I could wave my wand and grow habitat wherever it is or could be. I just said, let's pretend all that's owl habitat. So up here is current, and here's what happens if I could grow habitat on all of these locations. I have managed to turn most of my green into a different color, meaning I've pushed things in the wrong direction in terms of owls. This is just a visual way to display tons of complex tables to the line officer and to ourselves. So, epiphany at this point. Based on the gaming that we did with each of our values, we were able to sit down, myself and the silviculturist who was then acting as a fuels person, and said, okay, where is the high value owl habitat? And where is it most sustainable? And basically looking at those north slopes with the great structure, the large tree structure. And we came up with a desired landscape condition. So green does not mean we're not treating it. I've got clear cuts up in here. But this is an area where we are going to take those clear cuts and get rid of the off-site pine that was planted and plant Douglas fir. I want to maintain my existing high-value habitat here, and I want to put those young plantations on a different trajectory. I need owl habitat here. I've got an owl here that we need to preserve, but it is very, very low-quality habitat. Our hope is that by restoring this north slope, I can eventually pull that owl back into this location. There's a temporal component here. I can't do this overnight. But what this does is it creates areas where we want a great deal of open forest, single story in here. We're going to have landscape level burns and thinning to achieve that. It's going to help us compartmentalize the risk that we have to these areas that we want to preserve. And purple are areas where we've agreed we need some connectivity on this landscape. And we are going to manage for slightly higher density canopies in there so that owls can move around. Let's see. You can't see it on this slide, but we are also working closely with our P&W folks to look at the effects of these treatments on prey base for spotted owls. So we've got 2 years of baseline data, and after treatments, we'll keep measuring that. John Lemke helped us design it, and Peter Singleton is going to carry us through the end. So, what works well? An integrated landscape prescription from the get-go. It's no longer the owl alternative versus timber, and the highlights are there. We're not going to achieve resilience in one entry and in one part of this 39,000 acre watershed, but we can nudge things in the right direction. And that's what we have to do when we're in critical habitat and we've got occupied habitat. It's called threading the needle. Let's see, so couple of challenges, I think, though, is we do have issues of scale related to our habitat mapping, and that's going to play itself out in level 1. We took that DFC map out. The very first person that saw it, I think, was our level 1 rep. And we did get conceptual buy-off from Fish and Wildlife Service about the concept. We are going to be removing owl habitat, but we are going to be nudging our landscape towards a more resilient condition. We're going to maintain the high-value habitat. We're going to lose some of those small, isolated patches, but that's going to fix our edge density and our patch density problems. And we'll see where it goes. It's very much a work in progress. The epiphany was basically getting the ID team, the ranger, and our level 1 reps all to agree conceptually in that desired landscape condition. So that's how we're handling it on the Wenatchee. Ask me in 12 months whether it worked. We have already gone out with the proposed action and scoped it. We're getting interesting responses and very, very little concern expressed about the vegetation treatments. It's all the proposed road closures that came with this. So, huge response on the road closures. Yeah. So,
Let's save questions for after break for her and for California. So thank you, Joe. You're welcome.